Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. In this presentation, I aim to present the concept of loss as depicted within the first part of Paul Auster's postmodern novel, The New York Trilogy. I call it postmodern because the novel in many ways is an archetypal example of its genre. Everything from the concept of narrative to reality itself is questioned, and it is interesting to see how under the sea of chaos juxtaposed with stark emptiness, Auster manages to explore literary themes and honestly provokes the reader into questioning the nature of our existence, especially in what is an increasingly cold and artificial world. In City of Glass, the first book in the trilogy, the novel's main protagonist, a mystery novelist by the name of Quinn, unwittingly gets dragged into an altogether unbelievable circumstance in which he impersonates a private eye called Paul Auster, curiously named after the author, and slowly delves into the madness and incredulity of a case that he is called upon to investigate. Within the novel, not only is loss in its many facets present in the people that Quinn meets and interacts with, but throughout the novel he is forced to relive and deal with his own personal form of loss. Early on within the book, it is revealed that Quinn had a wife and son, both of whom are now dead. So already we expect the character in some ways to come to terms with this loss over the course of the novel. However, Auster attempts to further disorient the reader by rejecting literary and crime fiction genre conventions with the lines, who Quinn was, where he came from, and what he did are of no great importance. Immediately, this demolishes the presumed mutual, detached relationship between the author and the writer by transferring the focus away from the fictitious character and towards the reader himself. Such is a feature of postmodern literature, and perhaps even postmodernism by extension, in which the writer is constantly challenging the reader to question whether what he or she reads is important, as in this case also confused the reader with this ambiguous disclaimer. Incidentally, the idea of rejecting the relationship between the author and the reader may not be as arbitrarily implemented as one may first believe. Roland Barthes, in his essay, The Death of the Author, states that to give the text an author is to impose a limit on that text. I believe what he means by this is that the act of attributing a human being to the act of writing would immediately prompt us to overlook the merits of the text itself. Rather search for a meaning that we predict or assume that the author attempts to convey. Perhaps through this voluntary disconnection between the author, the reader, and the writer, the properties of the characters and the text itself would be apparent and significant. This allows Auster to better convey his themes in which words and style of writing of the text are mimetic of. This notion of uncertainty of importance is one that Auster utilizes in order not only to highlight the postmodern aspect of the novel, but also the theme of loss itself. Auster uses it to contrast the historical and cultural weight given to the loss of human life, notably concerning loved ones, with the slightly nihilistic concept of what does it actually matter. In this way, it could be seen that the ambiguity that he is portraying is simply a metaphor for the ambiguity of importance that we go through in everyday life, forcing the reader to reflect introspectively of how the significance of human life compares to the grand scheme of humanity. In any case, it is apparent that Quinn's loss has had an odd effect on him. He was said to not think about his son much anymore, which seems to suggest that he has dealt with it through pure neglect, that is, to completely fail to acknowledge that the loss he has experienced. Yet also disagrees and states that Quinn, every once in a while, will suddenly feel like what it had been to hold a 3-year-old boy in his arms. Which leads one to wonder, to what extent has Quinn managed to completely forget about his loss of loved ones? Perhaps not very well, considering that his subconscious occasionally relapses with painful memories. However, Auster again reverts to the nihilistic concept of death's insignificance, showing Quinn to believe it not only a physical sensation, an imprint of the past that has been left on his body and he had no control over it. It is as though Auster is merely dismissing the concept of death and its psychological impact as a simple afterthought, reducing it to mere physicality and kinesthetic memory. And though Auster seems to plainly state that Quinn is quite simply over the loss of his wife and child, there is some indication of the impact that has had on him through his pseudonym and alter ego, William Wilson. William Wilson, of course, was a character in Edgar Allan Poe's short story by the same name, and it is possible to carry over some of the more dark connotations that the name implies. In the short story, William Wilson was the name of the doppelganger that repeatedly returns to haunt the protagonist, leading to his eventual descent into insanity. Quinn, on the other hand, uses the persona of William Wilson in order to project himself in ways that he could not otherwise do. It provided a medium for him through which he could almost continue with life, despite the harrowing experiences that he has suffered. Through this also explores another form of loss, the loss of identity. The narrator states that Quinn was no longer the part of himself that could write books. He no longer existed for anyone else but himself. It is almost as though Quinn's loss of loved ones has led him to losing a sense of identity. He is no longer able to live life properly through himself anymore. Instead, he has created an alternate self, a self that maintains the facade of normality required to live within society, but at the same time retreating within himself in a manner that suggests that the loss hasn't managed to leave him completely psychologically unscarred. Reinforcing this, Quinn has said to wander aimlessly throughout the city, which always left him with the feeling of being lost. Again, it is apparent that Quinn is the vessel through which Auster experiments with the feeling of loss on the human psyche, and reveals that it can manifest in bizarre ways, as in Quinn's case. Quinn's desire for a loss of self is exemplified through when the narrator states that it was all he ever asked of things, to be nowhere. It is clear that Auster is examining the concept of a loss for a loss. He argues that the only true way for Quinn to deal with his loss is to jettison that part of him that carries any feeling towards it. Thus, one must lose a part of oneself in order to move on from tragedy. He did not want it coming back to haunt him. Auster does not limit the theme of identity loss to within the confines of the individual, but also to society as a whole. He uses the line, "New York was the nowhere that he had built around himself," which allows him to transfer the theme of loss into the macrocosm of urban society, where within a city of millions, it is impossible to retain a sense of self and uniqueness. In other words, modern society erodes the individuality of human society, forcing us to conform to a standard that society deems appropriate. Furthermore, it is apparent that through the disjointed and arbitrary nature of Quinn's journey, that Auster is trying to emphasize a lack of systematic coherency within the urban society. And by doing so, he's able to imply that the nature and condition of the people living in these societies are at least just as volatile and complex. 2008 marked a significant period in the history of humanity, as for the first time in our life, more than half the world's population lived in an urban environment. Thus, Auster's exploration of the nature of the city and its relationship with the human condition carries particular resonance in light of our continual search for meaning as modern citizens of the developed world. Auster presents two forms of loss in the opening of City of Glass. Firstly, the loss of loved ones, and how one deals with that loss. And secondly, the loss of identity, not only as a necessity to deal with grief, but also as an inherent and a precondition to living in an urban environment. Through both these themes, Auster attempts to explore the reality of the modern lifestyle, namely, how far have we disregarded the naturalism of humanity, and what have we lost along the way? Thank you. Yes, I guess.
What made you choose this topic of loss?
Nothing particular. I think it's just something that was particularly apparent to me when I read the book, and I thought it'd be good to do a presentation on it.
Thanks.
Question, Mr. Ware?
Auster writes in a very clean, unambiguous, stylistically fairly straightforward style, from what I remember. And, you know, how do you think that style, with its clear delineations, suits a topic which is, in your case, so suffused with ambiguity, to do with loss? Can you write about loss if you're being very accurate?
I think, going back to what we learned in class about how a lot of what postmodern literature is about is dealing with the complexity of the human condition, and of course dealing with loss is one of those complexities that writers for years have been trying to put into words but haven't quite managed to do that. And postmodern literature is another way of getting into that kind of genre where you, instead of flowering the situation with words and adjectives and nouns and verbs, all you do is just look at the facts and you dissect the condition of humanity in a way that, although you're using language that's stylistically straightforward and simple, you're actually delving into a much more deeper meaning, and you're rejecting literary conventions, and that alone allows the reader a sense of disorientation that can allow them to project themselves into the emotions of the author, where you can understand how loss is portrayed, I think.
You've used the phrase the human condition 2 or 3 times. Is there such a thing? San Franciscan stockbreakers seem very different to Balinese fishermen to me. Do they share a similar human condition?
I think, yeah, I do believe that they do, and again, going back to the theme of the modern lifestyle and how we have changed as a race, as a species towards, you know, we have to go through a different method of exploring that condition, because we have lost a sense, as I said, a sense of naturalism and the roots in our traditions. And so I think postmodern literature is a kind of a way to keep with the times and just explore our condition in another way.
Thank you.
Do you think that Quinn totally abandons the significance of death, or do you think it's just too much pain for him to think of the loss of his family, so he just tries to not think about it?
It's quite interesting in City of Glass, because the loss that Quinn has experienced because of his loss of wife and child wasn't really emphasized in that text. It was always apparent, and it was very clear to me, especially in the style of writing, but it was never really expanded upon, even in the writing. So it was never really clear what eventually happened to Quinn when he descended into that kind of nihilistic, nothing really matters, I'm staying in a dark room for the rest of my life. But I think that obviously knocked him out of balance slightly, and that really may have served as a catalyst towards him eventually, you know, tipping over the edge.
Do you think Quinn was deranged himself, or that the events surrounding him made him the way he was? You see what I mean? Is it surrounding that?
Yeah. Well, obviously, I think the most important events that we were told about Quinn's life was obviously first the loss of wife and child, and also the appearance of the Stillmans, and that mystery and I think it was a combination of a lot of things. First of all, he was disorientated and he was psychologically scarred by what happened with his wife and child, and also he was dragged into this. It was not a realistic story. I think if you were to read that as fate value, you would not believe that it actually happened in real life. Yet I think that the way that also portrayed it meant that it was less what actually happened as a story, but more an exploration of what Quinn in his pursuit of meaning in life. And I think that eventually led him to deciding that there really isn't any meaning, and I'm just going to stay in the room. David?
What is the main theme of the book, in your opinion?
Well, loss, actually.
Loss of identity.
Loss of identity, loss of self, and loss by which I mean dealing with loss of loved ones in particular.